The moment Graham Lawson rode into Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the autumn of 1883, he felt the particular chill of a place that already knew his sins before he could speak a word of them. He had been riding for 3 days straight through the flat, windswept Kansas prairie, his black duster coat caked with the fine red dust that gathered in every crease and fold of a man who lived too long on the open road. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Colonel that he had won in a card game outside of Dodge City 2 years prior, moved with the slow, deliberate patience of an animal that had learned its rider would not stop until something stopped him. Graham had that quality too, that dangerous, directionless momentum that kept a man moving forward simply because stopping meant facing everything that had been left behind. Caldwell Creek was not remarkable by any Kansas standard of 1883. It had a main street with the usual collection of weathered wooden storefronts, a saloon called the Copper Penny that leaned slightly to the left as if it had been drinking its own product for too long, a general store with its porch display of iron pots and seed bags, a telegraph office, a small white church whose bell tower was missing its bell, and a livery stable at the far end of the street where an old Mexican man was hammering a new shoe onto a reluctant mule. The town had the particular kind of quiet that settled over a place in the middle of the afternoon, when most honest people were indoors working, and the dishonest ones were still sleeping off the previous night. Graham reined Colonel to a slow walk down the center of the main street, his dark eyes moving from building to building with the practiced assessment of a man who had survived 15 years of hard living by reading every room, every street, and every face before committing himself to anything at all. He was 34 years old, though he looked older in the lines around his eyes and younger somehow in the uncertainty that lived behind them. He wore a Colt single-action Army revolver on his right hip, holster low and tied at the thigh, and the men who saw him walk into the saloons and gambling halls of the frontier had learned not to make a joke of it. He had not intended to come to Caldwell Creek. He had intended to pass through on his way to Colorado, where a man named Foster Greer had offered him $50 to deliver a sealed document to a land agent in Pueblo. It was the sort of job Graham had been doing for years now, the kind of work that did not require him to give a real name or form a genuine attachment to any particular piece of geography. But 3 miles east of town, Colonel had thrown a shoe, and Graham had faced the choice of walking his horse to destruction across the rocky ground or finding the nearest settlement with a blacksmith. So here he was, in a town he had not chosen, riding past faces that did not know him, past a general store that had a hand-painted sign reading BRENNER's Dry Goods in faded blue letters above the door. He would not have looked twice at that sign under ordinary circumstances. He would have tied Colonel outside the livery, waited for the shoe to be fixed, and been back on the road before sundown. That was the plan, and Graham Lawson lived by plans because spontaneity, he had learned at great and painful cost, was how a man ended up with a life he could not recognize. But when he pulled Colonel up at the livery and swung down from the saddle with the careful deliberateness of a man whose back had seen too many nights on the hard ground, a child ran out from between the buildings and nearly collided with his legs. The child was a boy, perhaps 7 years old, with a mop of dark brown hair and a spray of freckles across the bridge of his nose, wearing a pair of denim trousers that were too big for him, and a cotton shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone from whatever its original color was to a pale, soft blue. He looked up at Graham with wide brown eyes that carried the specific fearlessness of a child who had not yet learned that strangers could be dangerous, and then he grinned, revealing a gap where his 2 front teeth had recently been. "Mister, your horse has only got 3 shoes," the boy announced, as if this were news Graham had been waiting all day to hear. "I am aware," Graham said. "Jimmy Ortega can fix that. He is the best farrier in the county. He fixed Mrs. Haverson's horse when everyone said it could not be fixed, and that horse is still going strong. Is that right? It is absolutely right, the boy said, with the severe sincerity that small children bring to statements of fact. I am Thomas. What is your name? Graham looked at the boy for a moment longer than was comfortable. There was something about the line of his jaw, something about the particular way the afternoon light caught his hair, that made the fine hairs on the back of Graham's neck rise in the way they did when a situation was about to become complicated. Graham, he said, which was true enough. Are you a gunfighter, Graham? You look like a gunfighter. Jimmy Ortega says he can always tell a gunfighter by the way they hold their shoulders. Jimmy Ortega sounds like a man of considerable wisdom. He is. He also spits tobacco juice, and Mama says it is a filthy habit, but she still lets him fix our horses because he is the best. Your mama sounds like a practical woman, Thomas nodded with great conviction. She is the most practical woman in Caldwell Creek. She says so herself. Despite himself, Graham almost smiled. Where is Jimmy Ortega? Thomas pointed down the street toward the livery. Down there. But if you need anything from the dry goods store, that is our store. Brenner's. You should come in. We have good things. I will keep that in mind, Graham said, and took Colonel's reins and began walking him toward the livery. He had gone perhaps 20 feet when the door of Brenner's dry goods opened, and a woman came out onto the porch, shielding her eyes with one hand against the afternoon sun, scanning the street in the way of a mother who has just noticed the sudden absence of a child. Thomas Brenner, what have I said about running into the street? Her voice carried a firm authority that was not unkind, a voice that had been used to making itself heard across distances, across wind, across the particular inattention of a 7-year-old boy who found everything in the world more interesting than whatever he had been told to stay put for. She was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a faded calico bonnet, a few loose strands escaping around her temples where the afternoon heat had coaxed them free. She wore a practical dark green dress, an apron over it dusted with flour, and she had the kind of face that a man noticed not for any single feature but for the totality of it, the way everything came together into an expression of intelligence and warmth, and a kind of weariness that had not yet hardened into bitterness. She caught Graham's eye then, and something happened that he would spend the next several weeks trying to explain to himself and never quite managing it. It was not recognition exactly, because she had never seen him before in her life. It was something more like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air changes quality and every living thing on the prairie goes very still. I apologize, she said, in a tone that suggested she was apologizing for the specific behavior of the child and not for herself or for existing. Was Thomas bothering you? Not at all, Graham said. He was informing me about the town's premier farrier. She glanced at Colonel's 3-shoed foot with the quick assessment of someone familiar with horses. Jimmy is the best. He will have that sorted out within the hour if you catch him before he starts his supper. Thank you, Graham said. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second too long to be entirely neutral, and then she looked away and called Thomas to come back inside, and Graham continued down the street with Colonel, feeling unreasonably unsettled for a man who had been cooling himself for years against exactly this kind of disturbance. Jimmy Ortega was a compact, capable man of about 50 with iron-gray hair and the permanently blackened hands of a man who worked metal for a living. He looked at Colonel's hoof with the same calm assessment that good craftsmen bring to a problem they have seen 100 times before, quoted Graham a fair price, and told him to come back in 2 hours. Graham paid him half up front, which Jimmy accepted with a nod that suggested it was more than the usual deposit he received from passing strangers. Graham took his saddlebags and walked back up the main street toward the Copper Penny Saloon, intending to have a whiskey and wait out the 2 hours in the way he usually waited things out, which was to sit with his back to a wall and watch the room and not let himself need anything from anyone in it. The saloon was dim and smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the particular sourness of whiskey absorbed over years into unfinished wood. There were 4 men at the bar and 2 at a card table in the corner, and the bartender was a broad, red-faced man named Cal, according to the chalkboard behind the bar, who poured Graham a decent whiskey without being asked what he wanted, which meant Graham must have looked like what he was. He took the whiskey to a corner table and sat with his back to the wall and looked at the room. He did not mean to think about Dorothy Brenner. He meant to think about nothing in particular, which was his usual method of spending time in spaces like this one. But she came back to him anyway, the way she had shielded her eyes against the sun, the way her voice had carried that particular combination of command and care, the way she had looked at Colonel's hoof with the eyes of someone who actually noticed things. He had known a woman once. Her name had been Claire, and she had been everything that was gentle and hopeful about the world. And he had left her on a cold morning in the winter of 1874, because he had been 25 years old and terrified of the life that was forming around him like something he had not chosen and did not know how to hold. He had told himself at the time that it was for her sake, that a man like him had no business being someone's husband, no business sitting still in any one place when every instinct in him screamed to move. He had told himself that she would be better off without him, and he had told himself that story for 9 years with the practiced determination of a man who needed the story to be true. He had heard she married someone else, a year or 2 after he left. He had not asked for details. He had been in a different state by then, and deliberately not listening. He drank his whiskey slowly and watched the room and tried not to think about Claire. He was on his second whiskey when the trouble started. It came in through the saloon's swinging doors in the form of 3 men who moved with the swagger of people who had established some local authority and were not in the habit of having it questioned. They were not outlaws in the classic sense, not wanted poster men with bounties on their heads. They were the other kind, the kind that was worse in certain ways, local bullies with enough money or connections to make the sheriff look the other way, and enough appetite for dominance to make everyone around them smaller. The largest of the 3, a man with a broad, coarse face and a drooping brown mustache, swept his eyes around the saloon in the way of someone who was used to assessing what he could take from a room, and his gaze landed on Graham with the particular attention of a man who recognized a type and was trying to figure out whether it was a threat or a resource. "Stranger," the mustached man said, not as a greeting but as a statement of category. Graham did not respond, which was generally his preferred opening position. "You riding through or staying?" The man pulled a chair out from a nearby table and sat on it backwards, arms folded over the back, with the casual physical confidence of someone who had not been told no in a long time. "Passing through," Graham said. "Name's Holt, Silas Holt. I know most everyone who comes through this town, and I do not know you. No reason you would." "See, that is the kind of answer that makes a man curious," Silas Holt said, and one of his companions, a wiry young man with pale eyes, snickered in the way of someone who had been conditioned to find his employer amusing. "What is your business here, stranger?" "My horse threw a shoe." "That is unfortunate." Silas Holt did not look like he found it unfortunate at all. "And you are heading where exactly?" "Colorado." "What is in Colorado?" "Work," Graham said, in the tone that he used specifically when he wanted a conversation to end. Silas Holt studied him for a moment with the eyes of a man doing calculations, and then he apparently decided that whatever the result of those calculations was, it did not require immediate action. He pushed back from the chair, nodded at Graham with the false camaraderie of someone filing something away for later, and led his 2 companions to the bar. Graham watched them in the mirror behind the bar. He watched the way Cal's posture changed when they walked in, the subtle contraction of a man who has learned to make himself smaller around certain people. He watched the way the other men at the bar shifted without quite moving, creating a small, unconscious distance between themselves and Holt's group. He had seen this before in a dozen towns. The particular ecosystem of a place where one man had decided He was owed more than his share, and everyone else had slowly adjusted their behavior to accommodate that belief, because the alternative cost too much. After a moment, he heard Holt say, loudly enough to carry, "Someone ought to tell the Brenner widow that her lease payment is 3 days late. Wouldn't want her to have any trouble with the property." And something in Graham's chest did a thing it had not done in years. He finished his whiskey, left a coin on the table, and walked out of the saloon into the afternoon light. He stood on the porch of the Copper Penny for a moment, not quite sure what he was doing or why he was doing it, and then he walked down the street to Brenner's Dry Goods. The bell above the door made a small cheerful sound when he pushed it open, and the smell of the place reached him before his eyes fully adjusted to the dimmer interior. It smelled of grain and dried herbs, and the particular kind of clean that comes from regular scrubbing with lye soap and determination. The shelves were well organized, fully stocked, the labels all turned to face outward, the kind of care in the arrangement that spoke of someone who treated their work as a matter of personal dignity. Dorothy Brenner was behind the counter, writing in a ledger with the focused attention of someone doing accounts. She looked up when the bell rang, and when she saw it was him, something in her expression shifted, not quite surprise, not quite wariness, something that did not have a clean name. "You are back," she said. "Jimmy Ortega fixed that shoe already." "Not yet, I have an hour still." "Then you must need something from the store," she said, which was practical and left him the option of pretending that was true. He looked around at the shelves for a moment. "Coffee," he said, "if you have it." "I have it," she said, and reached behind her to the shelf where several paper-wrapped bags of coffee sat in a neat row. She named the price, and he paid it without negotiating, which he could see she noticed. He stood at the counter with the bag of coffee he did not particularly need and tried to figure out what he was actually doing here, and could not produce a satisfying answer. "Thomas is your son," he said. "He is," she said, and there was both pride and a particular bracing quality in her voice, the tone of a woman who was used to people having opinions about a widow raising a boy alone. "He is a good boy," Graham said, confident. Something in her expression softened fractionally. "He is. He is also a boy who should have stayed on the porch when I told him to, but yes, he is good." She looked at Graham with a directness that he found both unsettling and refreshing, the kind of look that did not bother with the usual social customs of gradual mutual assessment. "Where are you from?" It was a simple question, and he had a simple answer prepared, the answer he always gave, which was to name whatever the last large town he had passed through was. But looking at her, at the directness of her eyes, which were a deep, steady brown, he found the easy lie sitting differently in his mouth than it usually did. "Most recently Dodge City," he said, which was true. "And before that, a lot of places." She seemed to consider whether to push further and decided not to, which he found he respected. "Well," she said, closing her ledger with a definitive sound, "I hope Jimmy Ortega's work serves you well and you make Colorado before the weather turns. We are liable to get our first frost any week now." It was a dismissal that was not unkind, the statement of a busy woman who had accounts to balance and a store to run, and no particular reason to extend conversation with a stranger who had bought coffee he probably did not need. Graham picked up his coffee and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Brenner," and walked back out into the afternoon. He stood on the porch again for a moment, and he was aware that he was standing there longer than was necessary, aware that Colonel's shoe would be fixed within the hour, and there was no rational reason to be standing on the porch of a dry goods store in a town he had not intended to stop in. He was aware of all of this, and he stood there anyway, looking up the street at the slow, ordinary traffic of a small Kansas town going about its afternoon business, and he thought about Silas Holt's comment about the Brenner widow and a late lease payment. He did not know what he was going to do about any of it. He told himself he was going to do nothing, collect his horse, and ride west. He told himself this 3 or 4 more times over the course of the hour he spent sitting on the bench outside the livery waiting for Jimmy Ortega to finish Colonel's shoe. He was still telling himself this when Jimmy said, "She is done," and Graham paid the balance and saddled up and walked Colonel to the edge of town. He stopped at the edge of town. The road west was straight and clear, and the late afternoon sky had gone that particular gold that the Kansas prairie specialized in, the kind of light that made even the most ordinary landscape look like something painted by a man who had been trying to prove something. The road led to Colorado and $50 and the comfortable anonymity of continuing to be a man who moved through places without leaving marks. He sat on Colonel for a full minute, looking at that road. Then he turned around and rode back into Caldwell Creek. He told himself he was looking for a place to sleep, which was partially true. It was getting on toward evening, and riding in the dark was poor sense. He would stay the night, sleep in the stable or find a room, and leave in the morning when the light was good. That was all. That was the entire and complete plan. He found a room at the only boarding house in town, run by a Mrs. Haverson, who was a substantial woman of 60 with the energy of someone half her age and opinions on every subject, which she shared freely as she showed him to his room. The room was clean and small and had a window that looked out over the back garden, where the last of the autumn tomatoes were still holding on in the cooling weather. "You will be staying how long?" Mrs. Haverson asked. "Just the night," Graham said. She looked at him with the evaluating eye of a woman who had been taking in boarders for 20 years and had developed a specific talent for the gap between what people said and what they meant. "Supper is at 6, she said, and left him to it. He washed his face and hands in the basin on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and thought about Dorothy Brenner's eyes and the way she had closed her ledger and the careless, proprietary contempt in Silas Holt's voice when he had mentioned her late lease payment. He thought about the boy Thomas with the 2 missing teeth and the fervent opinions about farriers. He went to supper at 6. Mrs. Haverson's dining room had 4 tables, and he was not the only boarder. There were 2 railroad surveyors passing through, a pair of quiet men who spoke to each other in low tones about grades and distances, and an older woman who was traveling east to see her sister and had been delayed by a broken axle on her wagon. There was also Thomas Brenner, sitting at the corner table with a plate of roasted chicken and boiled potatoes in front of him, and Dorothy Brenner across from him, who looked up when Graham came in with an expression that managed to be equally surprised and composed. "You are still here," she said. "I am staying the night," he said. "The road to Colorado is better in daylight." She considered this with the carefully neutral expression of a woman deciding whether this was her business or not, and concluded apparently that it was not. "Thomas, move over so the man can sit. Mrs. Haverson does not have enough tables." "I do not want to impose," Graham said, though he was already moving toward the table. "You are not imposing," Dorothy said. "We have chicken and it is getting cold." He sat, and Mrs. Haverson appeared with another plate almost immediately, because Mrs. Haverson was the kind of woman who had everything arranged before you knew you needed it. Supper at the Haverson boarding house turned out to be the most honest 2 hours Graham had spent in years. Thomas Brenner, freed from the constraint of the store where presumably some level of behavior was expected, turned out to be a child of vast and ambitious curiosity, who had questions about Colorado, about Colonel, about whether Graham had ever seen a real buffalo, about what a gunfighter actually ate for breakfast, about whether it was true that Wyatt Earp was as tall as they said he was. Graham answered the questions about Colorado and Colonel honestly, and the others with varying degrees of creative interpretation. Dorothy ate her supper and watched her son with an expression of mingled exasperation and absolute devotion, occasionally redirecting the conversation when it veered into territory she found inappropriate for a 7-year-old's dinner table, which mostly involved the mechanics of gunfights. She asked Graham measured, practical questions about the road west and the weather and whether he had come through Wichita, and he answered them, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation, he stopped calculating what he was saying and simply said what was true. It was a peculiar feeling, like putting down something heavy that you had carried for so long you had forgotten the weight of it. After supper, Thomas fell asleep in his chair with his cheek on his folded arms, and the conversation went quiet in the way of conversations between two people who have been talking around something and suddenly run out of the things they have been using as substitutes for it. "He does not normally fall asleep at the table," Dorothy said, looking at her son with soft eyes. "It has been a busy week." "He is a good boy," Graham said again, because it was still true. "His father would have adored him," she said, and the shift in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, the particular careful way of speaking about someone whose absence is still part of every room. Graham did not ask, but she told him anyway, in the brief, factual way of someone who has told the story enough times that they have found a version of it they can live with. Her husband, Robert Brenner, had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1881, when Thomas was 4 years old. He had built the dry goods store himself, and she had taken it on after he died because the alternative was to go back east to family she had not seen in years, and she had decided that what she and Thomas had was here, in this store in this town, and she was not going to let it go. "Holt has been making things difficult," she said, and the way she said it suggested she had not meant to say it at all, that it had come out of some accidental overing of the usual walls. "Silas Holt," Graham said. She looked at him sharply. "You know him. I spoke with him briefly at the saloon. He mentioned the lease payment." Dorothy's jaw tightened in a way that held a significant amount of contained anger. "He bought the building 2 years ago from the family Robert had leased it from for 10 years before that. He has been raising the lease incrementally ever since, and I believe he is trying to squeeze me out so he can take the building for himself. He has no use for it, particularly. He just does not like that I will not sell him my business. Has he made a specific offer? 3 separate ones. The last one was an insult dressed up in polite numbers." She paused and looked at her hands, which were folded on the table with a deliberateness that suggested they had been doing something less composed a moment before. "I should not be telling you this. You are a stranger and you are leaving tomorrow." "I am," Graham agreed. The silence that followed had a texture to it, something more complicated than the usual silence between people who do not know each other well. "Well," Dorothy said at last, and gently shook Thomas's shoulder until he stirred, blinking and disoriented, and she scooped him up with the practiced ease of a woman who had been carrying this particular child for years, and told Graham good night, and left. Graham sat at the table with his coffee and looked at the empty plates and tried to remember the last time he had eaten supper with someone else, and found it entirely unremarkable and entirely good. He could not remember. He went to bed and did not sleep particularly well, and in the morning he got up early and went to the livery and looked at Colonel for a long time, and then he went to the general store 2 doors down from the Copper Penny and asked the man there where he might find the county land records office. The land records office was a small, cluttered room attached to the back of the sheriff's office, maintained by a tired-looking clerk named Purvis who wore reading spectacles and had the general demeanor of a man who was profoundly unimpressed by everything he had ever encountered. Graham asked him about the lease agreements on the properties along the main street, and Purvis pulled out a thick ledger and found the relevant pages with the slow, meticulous care of someone who did not hurry for anything. What Graham found in those pages was interesting. The original lease Robert Brenner had signed was a 10-year agreement with a fixed rate. When Silas Holt had purchased the building, he had served Dorothy a new lease that bore the same term and the same original rate, and Dorothy had signed it because she had been in the middle of grief and managing a business and a 4-year-old, and had not had the time to read it with the full attention it deserved. The lease Holt had given her, however, contained a clause in the fine print that allowed him to raise the rate by up to 15% annually at his discretion. 2 years of increases had moved the rate from something manageable to something that was becoming genuinely difficult. The late payment Holt had mentioned was the first Dorothy had missed in 2 years of fighting to keep up. Graham looked at the document for a while. Then he thanked Purvis, who was already looking back at his own papers with profound indifference to whatever conclusion a stranger had drawn from the information, and walked back out into the morning. He walked to Brenner's dry goods, which was not yet open, and knocked on the side door that he correctly guessed led to the residence attached to the back of the store. Dorothy opened the door still in her work dress, Thomas at her elbow eating a piece of bread and looking enormously interested in the proceedings. "You are still here," she said, which had become a theme. "I want to show you something," Graham said. "Something in your lease agreement. Do you have a copy of it?" She stared at him for a moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating. "Yes," she said carefully. "Come in." The living quarters behind the store were small and scrupulously neat, with the same quality of careful organization that the store shelves had, the dignity of someone who would not allow their circumstances to make them careless. There was a table, 4 chairs, a cook stove, shelves of dishes and books, and a child's drawing of what appeared to be a horse pinned to the wall beside the window. Dorothy went to a tin box on the shelf and produced a folded document and handed it to Graham. He found the relevant clause, read it aloud to her, slowly and clearly, and watched the sequence of expressions move across her face as she understood what she was hearing. First, she went pale. Then her expression went through something complicated and precise, the specific combination of anger and fear and the sick recognition of having been deceived by something she had trusted. Then her jaw set, and the fear burned away into something harder and cleaner. "He had this put in deliberately," she said. "Yes. He was planning to do this from the beginning. It appears so." She took the document back from him and read the clause herself, and her lips moved slightly as she read it, and then she folded it again with sharp, controlled movements. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. It was a fair question, and he took a moment before answering it. "Because someone should have shown you sooner," he said, which was true as far as it went. She looked at him with the steady, measuring look that he had noticed the day before, the kind of look that did not accept surface answers. "You are a man passing through on his way to Colorado," she said. "You have no reason to involve yourself in this." "I am still here," he said, borrowing her own phrase, which made something move briefly in her expression. "You could leave," she said, "today. You have a horse with 4 shoes and a road west." "I could," he agreed. She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked at Thomas, who was watching the entire exchange with the bright, unabashed attention of a child who has understood that something significant is happening without knowing precisely what. "What would you do?" she asked Graham. "If you were in my position, what would you actually do?" He sat down at the table without being invited, which she permitted without comment, and he thought about the question seriously because it deserved to be thought about seriously. "First," he said, "you need to talk to a lawyer. There is one in Wichita who handles property disputes. I have seen his name on a notice board. His name is Clement Adair. He would know whether that clause can be challenged." "I cannot afford Wichita lawyers," Dorothy said, sitting down across from him with the directness of someone who had decided that this conversation was going to be honest. "You might be able to afford one if you can get the other leaseholders on this street to join you. Holt owns 3 of these buildings, I checked. If the others have the same clause in their leases, you have a collective case that is more substantial than a single complaint from a widow with a dry goods store." She was quiet for a moment. "How do you know all of this?" "I looked at the county records this morning." "Why?" He met her eyes. "I am not entirely sure," he said honestly. She looked at him for a long time and said nothing, and he did not try to fill the silence, and Thomas, apparently sensing that the interesting part of the adult conversation was over, wandered away to look at something more interesting on the far side of the room. "The man at number 6, Harlan McCree, has been complaining about his lease for the past year," Dorothy said finally. "And the woman who runs the millinery at number 11, Clara Voss, said something similar last spring. Then you have 3 parties with a common complaint and a legitimate legal question," Graham said. "That is not nothing." Dorothy folded her hands on the table and looked at them. "You could have left this morning," she said, not quite as a question. "Yes. But you went to the land records office instead." "Yes." She looked up at him with an expression that held several things in it, some of which he recognized and some of which he did not, and she said, "I do not know anything about you, Graham Lawson. You appeared yesterday with a lame horse and you have not left yet." "Those are the primary facts," he agreed. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face before she recalled it to its previous seriousness. "I am going to speak to Harlan and Clara today," she said. "And I will write to this lawyer in Wichita." "That seems like a good start," Graham said. He stayed. He told himself and told Mrs. Haverson when she asked about his plans that he was staying a few more days to see about a matter of business in the town, which was vague enough to mean anything and specific enough to satisfy the practical question. He extended his stay at the boarding house by the week and moved Colonel into the permanent side of Jimmy Ortega's livery rather than the temporary stall, and he spent his first full day in Caldwell Creek quietly learning the shape of the place. It was not a bad town. It had the usual elements of the complicated frontier settlement of 1883, the racial tensions that came with the meeting of so many different groups in a space still being contested and defined, the economic anxieties of farmers and merchants trying to make something permanent out of what had so recently been open grassland, the political undercurrents of a county where the law's actual reach depended enormously on the inclination of the individuals in charge of enforcing it. The sheriff was a man named Theodore Beckett, and Graham's assessment of him after 2 brief interactions was that he was not corrupt exactly, but that he chose his conflicts with a care that made Silas Holt's situation considerably easier than it should have been. Holt had his fingers in a number of things in Caldwell Creek: the 3 building leases, a partial ownership stake in the Copper Penny Saloon, and what appeared to be a lending operation that made money available to struggling farmers at rates that ensured they would struggle for a considerable time thereafter. He was not a spectacular villain of the kind that appeared in dime novels. He was the other, more common kind, a man of moderate intelligence and significant greed who had found a favorable position and was methodically extracting everything he could from it. Graham watched him from a comfortable distance, the way you watched any terrain you might need to navigate, and formed his assessments, and said nothing about any of them unless asked. What he did do was make himself useful. This was not a tactic, or at least it did not begin as one. It began with the simple fact that on his second morning in Caldwell Creek, Dorothy came out of her store to find that 3 of the boards on her store's front porch had rotted through to the point of genuine danger, and one of them had partially given way, and she was standing looking at them with the expression of a woman calculating how much this was going to cost at a time when she could not afford it. Graham had been passing by on his way to get breakfast, and he said, "I can fix those if you have timber." She looked at him with a skepticism that was entirely earned. "Can you?" "I have done worse repairs with less," he said. She had timber in the back of the store, and she had tools left over from what had been her husband's collection, and Graham spent the morning pulling the rotted boards and replacing them with the efficient, competent work of a man who had, during the long years of his wandering, done a considerable number of practical things that had nothing to do with the gun on his hip. By midday the porch was solid, and he had also, without being asked, replaced the latch on the store's front door that had been working loosely and would eventually fail at an inconvenient moment. Dorothy brought him coffee and looked at the repaired porch and said, "You are handy with a hammer," in a tone that suggested she was revising something. "There is a lot of time to learn things when you spend 15 years traveling," he said. She leaned against the doorframe with her coffee and looked at the main street in the way of a person thinking through something they are not quite ready to say aloud. "My husband was good with repairs too," she said. "He built the shelving inside the store. It is still solid as the day he put it up." "It is good shelving," Graham said. "I noticed it." She glanced at him and then back at the street. "What are you actually doing here, Graham?" It was the question she had been asking since the beginning, and he had been giving her the practical version of the answer: the horse, the records, the porch boards. He looked at the repaired porch and thought about the honest answer, and then he said, "I do not quite know. I think I needed to stop somewhere, and I stopped here." She was quiet for a while after that, and then she said, "Well, I need to open the store," and went inside. Over the following days, something happened between them that was too gradual and too quiet to be called anything as dramatic as falling, but that had the same eventual result. It happened in the hours Graham spent in the store learning the daily rhythm of the place and helping where he could. In the evenings at Mrs. Haverson's table, where Thomas saved a seat for him with the casual possessiveness of a child who had decided that a person was his. In the occasional conversations on the porch of the store after Thomas was in bed, and the town had gone quiet, and there was no particular reason for either of them to stay, but neither of them quite left. Dorothy was not a woman who extended trust easily, and Graham found that he respected this the same way he respected everything about her: the intelligence in the way she organized her business, the particular quality of her love for Thomas which managed to be entirely devoted without being suffocating, the way she engaged the other people in the town, the fairness she extended to everyone who came into her store regardless of their circumstances. She was also, underneath the competence and the practicality and the armor of a woman who had learned to manage alone, a person of great feeling, which she expressed not in dramatic declarations but in small and unmistakable ways. The way she remembered what everyone preferred without being asked, the way she went quiet when something moved her instead of reaching for words that would not be adequate, the way she sometimes sat in the evenings with the last light coming through the window and looked like a woman who was holding something delicate and real. Graham had not intended to notice any of this. He noticed all of it. Thomas had no such ambivalence about the whole situation and appointed Graham immediately and without ceremony to a position of general useful companion, which primarily involved opinions on horses, on the correct method of whittling a stick, on whether hawks could see better than eagles, and on the enduring question of whether Jimmy Ortega's mule had a bad temper from natural disposition or from grievance. Graham answered all of these questions with the seriousness they deserved, and Thomas in return followed him around with the loyal, comfortable confidence of a boy who had been looking for exactly this and was glad to have found it. The matter of Silas Holt progressed more slowly. Dorothy had spoken to Harlan McCree and Clara Voss, and both had confirmed that their leases contained the same problematic escalation clause. Clara Voss had been not merely willing but actively eager to pursue the matter, being a woman of 62 who had run her millinery shop for 12 years and had a great deal of stored indignation about the directions things had been going since Holt bought the building. Harlan McCree had been more cautious, the caution of a man with a family who had weighed the cost of making an enemy of someone like Holt against the cost of the alternative, and was not yet sure which way the scales tipped. Dorothy had written to Clement Adair in Wichita, and they were waiting for a response. Graham had quietly introduced himself to a few of the other men in the town, the ones whose calibration of the social situation seemed to him most clear-eyed, and had begun to get a better sense of what could actually be done. On his 5th day in Caldwell Creek, Silas Holt stopped him on the main street. The encounter was not threatening in the explicit sense. Holt was not a man who preferred explicit threats. They were too risky, too easy to report, too likely to produce the kind of direct confrontation that the law was actually obligated to respond to. He preferred the implied kind, which had the useful quality of being impossible to quote exactly. "You have been in town a few days now," Holt said, falling into step beside Graham with the easy confidence of a man who expected his company to be welcome. "Thought we might have a more proper conversation." "I do not object to proper conversations," Graham said. "You have been spending time at the Brenner store. Dorothy is a fine woman. Difficult situation she is in, trying to keep that business going." "She seems to be managing it well enough," Graham said. Holt smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes, which were doing something considerably less pleasant than smiling. "The thing about this town," he said, "is that it is a small place. Relationships are important. A stranger coming through and stirring things up does not always understand how these relationships work." "Probably not," Graham agreed pleasantly. "I would not want someone to get the wrong impression about the way things are done here and then find themselves in an uncomfortable position as a result." "That would be unfortunate," Graham said. Holt stopped walking and Graham stopped with him, and they looked at each other for a moment with the mutual clarity of two people who have decided to stop pretending the conversation is about something else. "What is your interest in Dorothy Brenner?" Holt asked directly. Graham considered how to answer this question, and then he answered it with the truth, which he was finding increasingly useful. "She is a good woman running a legitimate business, and I think she is being treated unfairly," he said. "That tends to interest me." Holt's expression shifted through something very briefly before it settled back into the practiced pleasantness. "I see," he said. "Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Caldwell Creek, however long that turns out to be." He nodded and walked away. Graham watched him go and then continued in the direction he had been heading, which was the Land Records office, because Purvis had something to show him. What Purvis had was a copy of the original property deed for the building that Brenner's Dry Goods occupied, and in that deed there was language from the original land grant that placed certain restrictions on how the property could be used and what terms could be imposed on long-term commercial tenants. These restrictions had not been properly accounted for when Holt purchased the building, or more likely had been deliberately omitted from the purchase summary he had received. They did not invalidate the lease exactly, but they significantly complicated the enforceability of the escalation clause, and Clement Adair in Wichita, who had written back to Dorothy with impressive speed, had said in his letter that the combination of the original deed restrictions and the failure to disclose the escalation clause at the time of signing gave her a reasonable legal argument. He was willing to take the case for a fee structured around the outcome, which meant a portion of any settlement rather than an upfront payment, which was the most practical possible arrangement given the circumstances. Graham brought this news to Dorothy on a Thursday evening after Thomas had gone to bed, sitting on the repaired porch in the cooling autumn air with the last of the late-season crickets making their slow, intermittent sound in the dark. She read Adair's letter twice and then sat with it in her hands and said nothing for a moment. "This could work," she said at last. "It appears so. If Harlan McCree will commit." "I spoke with him today," Graham said. "He is going to commit." She looked at him. "When did you speak with Harlan McCree?" "This afternoon, when he came in for flour and I was repairing the hinge on your back door." She was quiet for a moment. "You spoke with him while you were repairing my hinge." "Multitasking," Graham said. Something happened in her face then, something warm and completely unguarded, and for a moment she looked at him with none of the careful composure that she wore with the practiced ease of someone who had needed it for a long time. And what he saw underneath, it was something that made his chest do the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency since he had failed to leave Caldwell Creek 5 days ago. Then she looked back at the letter and said, "I want to thank you," in a voice that was more unsteady than he suspected she had intended. "You do not need to," he said. "I do. You could have left Monday. You had a working horse and a road west and a job in Colorado." He looked at the street in the particular way of a man choosing his words with actual care. "The job in Colorado was $50 to carry a piece of paper," he said. "I have done a lot of things for $50 that I did not particularly need to do. This seemed like it mattered more." She set the letter on her knee and looked at him directly. "Why does it matter to you? You have been here a week, and you do not owe me anything. You do not know me." He turned to look at her and said, with the particular honesty of someone who has been practicing avoidance for so long that the truth comes out rough and unpolished around the edges, "I am getting to know you, and I think I have been spending a long time not letting myself get to know anybody, and I am tired of it." She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see her deciding something, the same way he had seen her decide things all week, with that quiet, thorough internal process that she did not make a performance of. "I am not easy," she said. "I have a child and a store and a legal dispute with the worst man in the county, and I have been managing on my own for 2 years, and I am very set in the way I do things." "I have noticed," he said. "I am telling you this because you are looking at me in a way that a man passing through does not generally look at a woman." He did not try to deny it. "I know," he said. "And I am looking back," she said, "in a way that I have not looked at anyone since Robert died, and I am trying to be honest about that instead of pretending it is not happening." "I appreciate the honesty," he said. "I also do not know who you are," she said. "Not really. You have told me facts, names of places, the general outline of a life, but not the whole shape of it." He looked at the dark street and said, "There are things I am not proud of." "There usually are," she said, without judgment. "Tell me one." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I left a woman once, years ago, a woman who cared for me and who deserved better than someone who ran because he was afraid of what staying would mean. I have carried that for 9 years." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you love her?" He considered this seriously. "I think I cared for her more than I knew how to hold at the time. I do not think I knew what love was when I was 25. I think I thought it was supposed to be easy, and when it started to be something real and complicated and requiring of me, I chose the road instead." "That is an honest answer," she said. "It is not a flattering one." "No," she agreed. "But I have more respect for an honest, unflattering answer than a flattering, dishonest one." He looked at her then, and the night had gone full dark, and the lamplight from inside the store came through the window and found the planes of her face, and he said, "I am not 25 anymore." "I know," she said quietly, and this time neither of them looked away. They did not reach for each other on the porch that night. They sat for another half-hour and talked about other things, about Thomas and about the store, and about what Kansas was like in the winter. And then she said good night, and went inside, and he walked back to Mrs. Haverson's in the dark, and slept better than he had in a considerable number of years. The situation with Holt moved toward its resolution over the following 3 weeks with the slow but increasing momentum of a thing that has been set properly in motion, and cannot easily be stopped. Clement Adair arrived from Wichita in person, which spoke well of how he assessed the case, and he was a sharp, compact man of about 45 who wore good suits and had the kind of eyes that missed nothing. He met with Dorothy and Harlan McCree and Clara Voss separately and then together, and he reviewed the deed and the leases and the corresponding records with the thoroughness of someone who intended to be unimpeachable, and he presented his findings to all 3 clients in Dorothy's store one afternoon with Graham and Jimmy Ortega present as witnesses. The case was solid. The escalation clause, combined with the original deed restrictions and the lack of explicit disclosure at the time of signing the new lease, gave all 3 tenants grounds for a complaint that could be brought to the county court. Adair had already been in touch with a judge in Wichita who had strong opinions about the kind of predatory leasing practices that were causing genuine hardship across the frontier territories. And while no outcome could be guaranteed, the legal landscape was considerably more favorable than Holt would have anticipated when he had structured the arrangements 2 years prior. When Holt was informed of the pending legal action through Adair's formal letter, delivered to him in the Copper Penny by a very composed and unintimidated Clement Adair in person, the response came back within 48 hours. He was willing to negotiate. Graham was not in the room for the negotiation. He had made it clear to Dorothy that this was her matter and her victory to conduct, and he meant it. He sat in the store with Thomas and helped the boy with his letters, which Thomas's mother had been teaching him at the kitchen table, and waited. Dorothy came back from the negotiation with Clement Adair and the expression of a woman who had just won something significant and was still processing what that felt like. "He is resetting all 3 leases to the original agreed rates," she said, "for a term of 10 years with no escalation clause. In exchange, We do not pursue the civil case." Graham set down the primer he had been using with Thomas and looked at her. "That is a good outcome." "It is an excellent outcome," she said, and sat down hard in the chair across from the table, as if her legs had been holding everything together until this moment and had now received permission to relax. "It is an extraordinary outcome." "It is a just outcome," Clement Adair said from behind her, looking satisfied. "Graham," Thomas said, looking up from his letters with some urgency, "can we celebrate?" "That is entirely up to your mother," Graham said. Dorothy looked at her son and at Graham and at the afternoon light coming through the store window, and she laughed, which was a sound that Graham decided immediately was one of the better sounds he had encountered in his 34 years. "We can absolutely celebrate," she said. They celebrated at Mrs. Haverson's, who required minimal persuasion to produce a very good supper from her kitchen on short notice, and who invited the railroad surveyors and Clara Voss and Harlan McCree and his wife, and the traveling woman who had finally gotten her wagon axle fixed, but had evidently decided to stay another week anyway, and Jimmy Ortega, who arrived with 2 bottles of something he said was wine, but which tasted considerably more ambitious than wine, and Clement Adair, who proved to be excellent company and had stories about frontier legal proceedings that were more dramatic than anything in the dime novels. Graham sat across the table from Dorothy and watched her be happy with the ease of a person who was seeing something they had not known they were waiting to see. After supper, when the evening had gotten late and Thomas had fallen asleep in a chair again, which appeared to be his standard response to emotional events, Dorothy found Graham on the porch of Mrs. Haverson's house looking at the stars, which were extraordinary on a clear Kansas night in the fall of 1883, the kind of stars that made a man aware of how much larger the world was than any one person's particular trouble. She stood beside him and looked at the stars too for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You did it," he said. "You and Adair and the others. You started it," she said. "You went to the land records office on your second morning here and you found what you found and you brought it to me, and you could have ridden to Colorado." He looked at the stars. "I could have," he said. She turned to look at him and he turned to look at her, and the distance between them on the porch was very small. "Are you leaving?" she asked. "Now that this is settled?" He held her gaze. "I do not particularly want to leave," he said. "Then do not," she said simply. And he reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood on the porch in the November air looking at the Kansas stars and holding on to each other in the quiet way of people who have found something they had not been certain they were still capable of finding. He kissed her for the first time that night, on the porch, in the dark, gently and without hurry, and she kissed him back. And inside the house Thomas slept on in the chair, and Mrs. Haverson, who had seen the whole thing coming and was not surprised at all, made herself very busy with the dishes. The weeks that followed were the strangest and the best of Graham Lawson's adult life. He found himself waking up in the morning with a specific orientation, the sense of a day that had a shape and a content and a purpose, rather than the formless traveling that had been his existence for so long. He helped at the store, and he helped Thomas with his letters and numbers, and he fixed things when they needed fixing, and he sat with Dorothy in the evenings and talked in the thorough, intimate way of 2 people who have decided to trust each other. They talked about Robert, whom Dorothy had loved genuinely and grieved properly, and who was part of her in the permanent way that a good person always is after they are gone. Graham listened to these conversations with the respect and care they deserved, and he did not compete with the memory of a good man. He simply let it be what it was, part of the person he was coming to love. They talked about Claire, and about the years Graham had spent moving and the particular damage that kind of life does to a person's ability to believe that staying is possible. Dorothy listened to this with the same serious attention she brought to everything and asked questions that made him think harder than he would have done alone. "Do you think she is well?" Dorothy asked one evening about Claire. "Wherever she is." "I hope she is," Graham said. "I heard she remarried a year or 2 after I left. I hope it was good for her. "It was not kind what you did," Dorothy said, carefully and without cruelty. "But you know that." "I do," he said, "and you understand it well enough now to not do it again." He met her eyes and said, "Yes." "Good," she said, and that was that. He asked Dorothy to marry him on a cold morning in December, in the store before it opened, with Thomas standing in the doorway to the back, because he had developed an unerring sense for significant events and positioned himself accordingly. He did not have a ring. He told her he would get one, that he wanted to, that he was going to ride to Wichita after Christmas and find something worthy of her, and she said she did not care about rings, which he suspected was not entirely true but which was kind, and he asked her anyway, plainly and honestly, sitting across the counter from her with the morning light through the window and the Kansas winter just beginning to press against the glass. "I love you," he said, "and I want to stay. I want to be here with you and with Thomas, and I understand if you need time to decide because I have given you every reason to be cautious about a man who appeared with a lame horse 6 weeks ago and has been underfoot ever since." Dorothy looked at him for a moment with all of the specific weight of who she was, the intelligence and the care and the weariness that had never turned into bitterness. "You have not been underfoot," she said. "You have been help, real help, the kind that does not keep a tally." "So is that a yes?" Thomas said from the doorway. "Thomas," Dorothy said without looking at him. "Because I think it should be a yes," Thomas said. "I think Graham is excellent, and I think yes would be the correct answer." Dorothy looked at Graham with the expression of a woman who was smiling very hard at the inside of her face. "My son has expressed an opinion," she said. "I heard," Graham said. She looked at him and the smile broke the surface and she said, "Yes, Graham Lawson. It is a yes." Thomas made a sound that suggested this was the best possible news and disappeared back into the living quarters at a run. Graham reached across the counter and took Dorothy's hand and held it, and she held his hand back, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, because there was not anything else that needed to be said. They were married in February of 1884, in the small white church whose bell tower was still missing its bell, because the bell had been removed for repairs the previous spring, and the repair had encountered complications of the kind that small frontier town repairs frequently encountered. The church was full, because Caldwell Creek was a town of the size where everyone knew when something significant was happening, and it turned out that a considerable number of people had a warm feeling about Dorothy Brenner and a genuine respect for the quiet, capable stranger who had come in with a lame horse and stayed for her. Jimmy Ortega attended with his wife, Maria, and their 4 children. Clara Voss sat in the second row and cried with the unabashed enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting for this to happen, since the evening she had watched Graham help Thomas practice his letters in the dry goods store. Harlan McCree sat with his family and nodded at Graham with the nod of a man who had taken a measure and found it acceptable. Mrs. Haverson was there in a hat that had clearly been waiting for an occasion, and Clement Adair had sent a very kind letter that was read aloud at the supper afterward. Thomas stood at the front of the church in a new shirt that Dorothy had made him, beside Graham, in the formal position that he had negotiated for himself over the course of the preceding week. The negotiation had been brief and unambiguous. Thomas wanted to stand at the front, and Graham had said yes without needing to be asked twice. The minister, a serious young man named Reverend Calloway who had arrived in Caldwell Creek 6 months prior from Ohio and was still adapting to Kansas, read the service with a sincerity that Graham appreciated, and when he asked if Graham took Dorothy to be his wife, Graham said yes in the particular tone of a man making the most considered and certain commitment of his life. Dorothy's voice was steady and clear when she answered, the same quality she brought to everything, the absolute refusal to make a thing smaller than it was. When the service was done and they walked out into the February air, which was cold and brilliant with winter light, Thomas took Graham's hand on one side and Dorothy's on the other, and walked between them with the settled satisfaction of a boy who had arranged the world to his specifications. Graham looked at Dorothy over Thomas's head, and she looked at him, and the look had everything in it that they had built over those remarkable weeks since a lame horse had brought him to the wrong town, and the wrong town had turned out to be exactly right. The first year of their marriage had the texture that all true beginnings have, new and occasionally awkward and entirely worth it. Graham learned the full rhythm of the store and took on much of the heavy work, the deliveries, the supply negotiations with the wagon merchants who came through twice a month, the lifting and loading that Dorothy had been managing alone. He discovered that he had a talent for the trading aspect of the dry goods business, the ability to read what something was worth and what a person actually needed and find the point where those two things met favorably. And Dorothy said that he had a knack for it that Robert would have appreciated, which was the kind of thing she said when she meant something important. He also formally adopted Thomas in the spring, which required a visit to the county courthouse in a town 20 miles away, and a judge who asked Thomas directly if this was what he wanted. And Thomas said yes with a conviction that made the judge, who was not a particularly sentimental man, look down at his papers for a moment before proceeding. Thomas Lawson signed his name in the court record at the bottom of the page with intense concentration, having recently mastered his signature and being extremely proud of the result. The business with Holt had settled into something that was not quite peaceful but was manageable. He had kept to the terms of the agreement, and his previously expansive presence in the town's affairs had contracted somewhat, perhaps because the legal proceeding had demonstrated that his maneuvers were not as invisible as he had believed, perhaps because the quiet solidarity that had formed among the Main Street merchants had created a collective that was more difficult to exploit than isolated individuals. He still owned his buildings and his stake in the saloon and his lending operation, and he was not a man who changed his fundamental nature, but the town had shifted around him in a way that narrowed his room considerably. Graham watched this with the patient observation of someone who had learned that the best resolution to a situation like this was not a confrontation, but a realignment of the ground on which the confrontation could occur, and the ground had been realigned. The summer of 1884 brought the news that Dorothy was expecting a child. She told Graham on a warm evening in June when Thomas was out in the yard, engaged in a project involving an ambitious construction of small logs that he said was a fort, but that Graham privately thought bore more resemblance to a complicated kind of nest. She told him simply and directly as she told him everything, and watched his face for what his response was before she said anything further. His response was to sit down in the chair at the kitchen table and be unable to say anything at all for a moment, which was not his usual manner of responding to information. "Graham," she said. "I am fine," he said. "I am very fine. I am just—" He stopped and tried again. "I have never been anyone's father," he said. "I mean, Thomas, yes, and I would not trade that for anything. But a child from the beginning." He stopped again. Dorothy sat down across from him with the look she wore when she was being very patient with him, which was a look he had learned to recognize and appreciate. "You do not have to sort out your entire response right this moment," she said. "I want to," he said. "I want to tell you what I feel." "What do you feel?" He looked at her across the kitchen table in the long summer evening light and said, "I feel like the luckiest man in the history of the Kansas Territory." She smiled then, the full, unguarded smile that she had been giving him more freely as the months had passed, and reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. When they told Thomas, he was quiet for a moment in the way that children are sometimes quiet when they are processing something that requires actual processing, and then he said, "Is it going to be a boy?" "We do not know," Dorothy said. "I think it should be a boy," Thomas said. "Boys are better." "They are absolutely not," Dorothy said. "Graham, are boys better?" "I am not answering that question," Graham said wisely. "I think it is a boy," Thomas said, with the certainty of someone who has decided the facts and intends to proceed on that basis. The baby arrived in February of 1885, almost exactly 1 year after the wedding, during a snowstorm that kept the town buttoned up inside its buildings and the streets to themselves. Mrs. Haverson came and helped, along with Mary Ortega, who had attended many such occasions, and the evening went the way such evenings go, long and taxing and requiring more from Dorothy than anything else, and Graham sat in the room next to Thomas and held the boy's hand when the sounds from the other room made Thomas's face go uncertain. "She is going to be fine," Graham said, with a certainty he was manufacturing mostly from determination, but which he distributed to Thomas as fact. "How do you know?" Thomas said. "Because your mother is the most capable person I have ever known," Graham said, which was also true and which was more than just reassurance. The baby was a boy. He was also, according to Thomas, the best possible outcome, which he said loudly, and at length when Mary Ortega brought the baby out wrapped in the blanket Dorothy had made over the winter. They named him Robert James Lawson, for the man who had built the store and the family that Graham had been given, and Dorothy held him in the lamplight of the February evening, with the kind of expression that made Graham understand, fully and completely, exactly what he had nearly missed by riding west on a road he had not needed to take. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and at his wife and at Thomas, who had climbed up on the other side, and was examining the baby, with the intense critical assessment of a boy who intended to have opinions about him. And he felt the particular weight and gift of being where you were supposed to be with the people you were supposed to be with, which is the only feeling in the world that does not eventually require qualification. The years settled into their shape. Thomas grew with the confident acceleration of a boy who knew he was loved, and had decided to do a great deal with that knowledge. He learned his letters and his numbers faster than the school in Caldwell Creek could keep pace with, and by the time he was 10, he was reading the Kansas City newspapers aloud to the customers who came into the store, and discussing the contents with a seriousness that most adults found charming and a few found alarming. Graham taught him to ride properly and to handle horses, and the two of them spent Sunday mornings in the good weather going out on the prairie on Colonel, and on the small, steady mare they had bought Thomas for his 9th birthday, which Thomas had named Aristotle because he had just been told about Greek philosophers and found the connection apt. Robert learned to walk in the store, pulling himself up on the counter legs with the same focused determination that characterized his mother's approach to problems, and his first full sentence was a demand for a biscuit, delivered at breakfast with total clarity, which Thomas declared to be an excellent sign. Caldwell Creek itself changed in the ways that Kansas was changing in those years. The cattle trade that had made towns like Dodge City and Wichita into particular kinds of wild places had shifted and was moving westward, and Caldwell Creek, which had never been exactly on the cattle drive routes, became more firmly what it had always been angling toward, a stable agricultural community with its own identity and a growing sense of permanence. New families came and put down roots. The church got its bell back, finally, from the foundry in Missouri that had been holding it hostage to a series of repairs and corrections for 3 years. A school building was constructed in the proper sense, with 2 rooms, which Dorothy had been advocating for to the town council for 2 years. Silas Holt sold his buildings and his stake in the saloon and his lending operation in 1887 and moved somewhere further west. Graham watched him leave from the porch of the store without particular emotion, the way you watch the resolution of a thing that has been resolved for long enough that the watching is merely a formality. Dorothy said only that she hoped he had the good sense to become a different kind of person wherever he was going, which was more generous than he deserved and entirely characteristic of her. Jimmy Ortega retired from the livery when his son Miguel took it over at 20, and became instead a man of considerable leisure, who spent his mornings playing cards with a rotating group of similarly retired men, and his afternoons at his wife's kitchen table, which arrangement seemed to suit everyone involved perfectly well. On the evening of Graham and Dorothy's 5th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch of the store in the February cold, wrapped in a blanket, because they had sat on this porch on many significant evenings, and neither of them saw a reason to change the pattern. Inside the house, Thomas at 12 was supposedly watching Robert at 4, a responsibility he was taking seriously, audible through the window by the occasional sound of him reading something to his brother in an animated voice that suggested whatever he had chosen for the evening was considerably more exciting than standard reading material. 5 years, Dorothy said, looking at the main street of Caldwell Creek in the way she looked at things she loved. 5 years, Graham agreed. Are you happy? She asked in the direct way she asked everything. He looked at the street and at the repaired porch boards and at the lights of the town going about its evening business, and then he looked at Dorothy, her profile in the winter air, the particular warm and irreplaceable reality of her. I think I am happier than I deserve, he said. You deserve more than you think, she said. You always have. You just had to stop moving long enough to see it. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat in the cold February air and listened to Thomas read something enthusiastic to Robert inside, and the stars came out over the Kansas prairie in the particular extravagant way that was one of the few unambiguous gifts of this part of the world. He thought about the road west that he had not taken, and the horse with 3 shoes that had made the decision for him, and the boy who had run out of an alley and told him with complete confidence that he knew the best farrier in the county. He thought about the woman who had come out of her store and shielded her eyes against the sun and looked at him with that particular quality of attention that had felt, even on that first day, like something he had not known he had been waiting for. He had been running for 15 years from the idea of a life that required him to stay, and the life he had been running from had turned out to be nothing like what he had been afraid of. It had turned out to be this: a store with good shelving and a repaired porch. A boy who named his horse Aristotle and had fierce opinions about everything. A small son learning to walk on the store's worn floorboards. A woman of extraordinary intelligence and depth who had looked at a stranger with a lame horse and over the months and years given him the only thing that had ever mattered. The bell in the church tower rang 8 o'clock, which it now did reliably, and somewhere down the street someone laughed, and inside the house Thomas was still reading and Robert was still listening, and Dorothy's head was warm against Graham's shoulder in the cold winter air. I want to tell you something, Graham said. Tell me, Dorothy said. When I rode into this town, he said, I was almost nothing. I had been almost nothing for a long time. I had made myself almost nothing on purpose because I thought it was safer, and I want you to know that everything I am now, everything that has any value in me, I owe to you stopping me from being able to leave. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her breathing beside him, steady and real. You did the hard part yourself, she said. I just gave you a reason. It was a very good reason, he said. She lifted her head and looked at him, and he looked at her, and after 5 years the looking was still the same quality it had been on that first evening on this same porch, something that did not need words around it. I love you, he said. I love you, she said, with the simple directness of everything she ever meant. The spring of 1886 had brought Dorothy's 3rd pregnancy, and this time it was a girl, born in the long days of August, with her mother's steady eyes and her father's dark hair, and a voice that she deployed from the first moments of her life with total conviction. They named her Clara Rose, for Clara Voss, who had been the first in the town to know that something was happening between them, and who had cried at the wedding and cried again, when informed she was to be the baby's namesake, and for the rose bush that Robert Brenner had planted beside the back door in the first year of the store, and that Dorothy had tended faithfully through every summer since. Thomas, at 9, was considerably more impressed by Clara than he had expected to be, having stated his preference for brothers firmly, and at length during the preceding months. He held her with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who understood that they were holding something important, and had revised his prior position about the relative merits of sisters. Robert, at 1.5, regarded Clara with the equanimity of someone too young to have strong opinions about the matter, and primarily interested in whether she was going to interfere with his established routines, which she did, but in ways that he eventually accommodated. The store continued to grow, because Dorothy was good at her work and Graham was good at the trading end, and together they were better than either had been separately. By 1887, they had expanded into the vacant space next door, which had been a failed barber shop, and added a wider range of dry goods and hardware, and Dorothy had installed a small postal agency counter in the corner when the town's need for such a service exceeded what the telegraph office could provide. Graham had put away his gun, which was to say he had put it in the box under the bed where it waited in case the world required it of him, which it did not, in Caldwell Creek, in the ordinary run of his days. He was not a man without a past, and he did not pretend otherwise, and occasionally men passed through who knew his name from the years before, and he met those encounters with the calm clarity of someone who knew who he was now and was not unsettled by who he had been. Most of those encounters were unremarkable. The past, it turned out, was smaller than the life he was living. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, February of 1894, Graham Lawson stood on the porch of Brenner's Dry Goods, which was also Lawson's Dry Goods now, though the sign had kept both names, because Dorothy said that the sign meant something, and she did not see the reason to change what meant something just because things had changed, and watched the main street of Caldwell Creek in the winter evening light. Thomas was 19 and had just been accepted to read law at a school in Kansas City, which he had announced at Christmas with the combined triumph of someone who had been working towards something for years and the small sadness of someone who understood what achieving it meant. Graham had shaken his hand and Dorothy had cried, and Robert, at 9, had asked what law school was, and Thomas had explained it to him in the serious, thorough way that he explained things to his brother, which was one of the things Graham loved most about the young man Thomas had become. Robert was at the table inside working on his arithmetic, which he approached with the grimly competitive determination of a boy who intended to master it, expressing periodic frustration in sounds that carried through the window without quite being words. Clara, 8 years old and fully in possession of all the opinions she had been forming since birth, was helping him with the specific combination of patience and slight superiority that only an 8-year-old could deploy, and Robert was tolerating this with the even greater patience of a brother who had learned that Clara's help was generally accurate even when it was annoying. Dorothy came out and stood beside Graham with a shawl over her shoulders and looked at the street the same way he was looking at it. "Thomas leaves in March," she said. "He does," Graham said. "He is going to be extraordinary." "He already is," Dorothy said. "He is going to be a lawyer who can also shoe a horse," Graham said. "There is not a great demand for that combination, but he will be ready." Dorothy laughed, and the sound was the same sound it had been on the evening they had celebrated the settlement with Holt, the full and unguarded laugh of a woman who found something genuinely funny, and Graham found, as he always found, that it was one of the better sounds in his world. "I was thinking," Graham said. "About what?" "About whether we need a larger house," he said. "Robert is getting to the age where sharing a room with Clara is going to become a point of sustained negotiation." "Clara will win the negotiation," Dorothy said immediately. "Almost certainly," Graham agreed, "but the boy deserves to put up a fight in his own space." Dorothy considered this with the practical thoroughness she brought to domestic matters. "There is the plot behind the store," she said. "We own it. We have owned it since 1888 and done nothing with it." "I thought about that," Graham said. 3 rooms, a proper kitchen, a covered porch, something solid." She looked at him with the particular expression that meant she was adding something up. "You have already drawn plans," she said. "Some preliminary thoughts," he said. Graham Lawson, she said, with the specific tone she used when she was finding him entirely transparent and entirely endearing at the same time. I thought it might be something to work on this spring, he said. After Thomas leaves and things are quieter. She leaned against him and looked at the street. A proper house, she said. Yes, I think it is time. He put his arm around her, the same way he had on the anniversary 5 years ago, the same way he had 100 times in the years in between, each time both familiar and something more than familiar. The particular weight of a person who had become so entirely part of your life that the weight itself was its own kind of comfort. Graham, she said, yes, I am glad you had a lame horse. He smiled, which was something his face had learned to do more readily in the past 10 years than it had managed in the 30 before them. So am I, he said, every single day. The spring came with the particular extravagance that the Kansas prairie sometimes produced, wildflowers spreading across the grassland in colors that seemed to belong to a different latitude, the sky going that deep saturated blue that made the whole world look like it had been freshly made. Thomas left for Kansas City in March with a new trunk, a letter of introduction from Clement Adair, and the composed, forward-looking expression of a young man who loved the people he was leaving and was going toward something that he had earned. Graham shook his hand at the stage stop and said, "Write to your mother." "Every week," Thomas said, and then with the directness that he had been using since the age of 7 to say things that mattered, "Thank you for everything." Graham said, "You have nothing to thank me for. Everything you are you brought with you." Thomas considered this with the lawyer's eye he was already developing and said, "That is a generous reading of the situation, but I appreciate it," and got on the stage. Dorothy watched it go until it was a dust cloud down the road, and then she took Graham's hand and they walked back up the main street of Caldwell Creek together. Robert built the house with Graham that summer, because Robert at 9 had decided he was old enough to help. And this turned out to be partially true and entirely valuable in ways that had less to do with the practical contribution, and more to do with the fact that some things are built not just from timber and nails, but from the hours spent on them together. By September they had 3 rooms and a covered porch, and a kitchen with a proper window that faced east so the morning light came in first thing, which Dorothy had specified from the beginning as the non-negotiable requirement. Clara Voss came to see the new house on the day they moved in, walking up from the millinery with a basket of preserves and her characteristic forthright warmth, and she stood in the kitchen and looked at the morning light window and said it was the most sensible thing she had ever seen anyone do with a kitchen. Graham stood in the doorway of the new house and watched his wife and his daughter, and the old woman who had been part of their story since the beginning moving around the new kitchen, with the easy fluency of people who know each other well. And he heard Robert in the backyard doing something loud and energetic that was probably legitimate. And he thought about the road west and the horse with 3 shoes, and the first morning he had woken up in Caldwell Creek and decided, without quite knowing it yet, that he was staying. He thought about the boy with the missing teeth who had told him about the best farrier in the county. He thought about the woman who had come out onto the store porch and shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun and looked at him with a directness that had no pretense in it. He thought about the 10 years between that first afternoon and this one, and everything that had happened in them, and he was aware that he was standing in the doorway of his own house looking at his own life, and that it was, in every way that mattered, the life he had needed to live, and that the only extraordinary thing about it was that he had managed to find it at all. Dorothy turned from the kitchen window and saw him standing in the doorway, and she looked at him with the same quality of attention she had always had, steady and warm and entirely real, and she said, "Come in, Graham. It is your home." He walked in. It was. Thomas wrote every week, as promised, and his letters from Kansas City were long and detailed and full of observations about the law and the city and the people he was meeting, and occasionally included observations about a young woman named Alina who he had mentioned first in passing, and then with increasing frequency. And then, in a letter in the spring of 1895, with the careful and deliberate thoroughness of a young man presenting a case he wished to be judged favorably. Dorothy read this particular letter twice and then handed it to Graham across the breakfast table. "He is in love," she said. "Yes," Graham agreed, reading the letter. "He does not say so." "He does not need to," Graham said. "It is in every sentence." Dorothy looked at the window with the expression of a mother who is feeling something complicated about her firstborn and managing it with characteristic steadiness. "She sounds like a good person," she said. "She does," Graham agreed. "I would like to meet her." "Write and tell him so," Graham said. "He will appreciate being given explicit permission to bring her." Thomas brought Alina home that summer, and she turned out to be exactly as the letters had suggested. A thoughtful, warm young woman of 21 with a sharp mind and a genuine interest in other people, who shook Dorothy's hand and Graham's hand, and then knelt down without ceremony to talk to Clara at Clara's own level, which was the moment Dorothy decided she was acceptable. Robert, at 10, spent the entirety of Alina's visit treating her with the grave courtesy of someone who had decided this was an important occasion, and intended to conduct himself accordingly, which Alina responded to with the serious respect he clearly needed from her, and which made Thomas look at Graham over the dinner table with the expression of a young man who understood that his family was something good. In the autumn of 1895, Thomas Lawson passed the bar examination in Kansas City and wrote to say he was coming home, that he and Alina were to be married in November, and he intended to open a practice in Caldwell Creek, because it was where he was from and it was where he wanted to be. The wedding was in the church with the bell, which rang loud and clear on that November morning, and Graham stood in the front row with Dorothy on his arm and Robert beside him and Clara on Dorothy's other side, and watched Thomas Lawson, his son, stand at the front of the church with the absolute calm of a young man certain of exactly what he was doing, and take his wife's hand and begin. After the ceremony, in the cold November air outside the church, Graham stood with Dorothy while the others moved around them in the cheerful noise of a celebration, and he looked at Thomas and Alina, and at Robert and Clara, and at the town that had been the wrong town and had turned out to be the only town, and he held Dorothy's hand in both of his with the particular grip of someone who understands what they are holding. "It is a good life," Dorothy said quietly, looking at it all with her steady, honest eyes. "It is the best life," Graham said, and he meant it in the full and absolute sense, without qualification or remainder, which was the only way he knew any more to mean anything at all. The Kansas sky stretched enormous and clear above them, and the bell in the church tower went quiet, and the town moved and breathed around them, and Graham Lawson, who had ridden into the wrong town on a horse with 3 shoes and had never managed to leave it, held his wife's hand in the cold November air and was, at last and entirely and without reservation, home.